The sun set in a blaze of orange and pink over the glittering city of Monaco, casting a warm glow over the towering glass skyscrapers and luxurious yachts bobbing in the marina. Inside one of the tallest buildings, the global headquarters of Lionel Enterprises, the employees were winding down for the evening. Conversations hummed through the hallways, the clinking of glasses signaling the end of another successful day in the world of high finance and elite power. Before we get into it, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story of love and resilience touches you, be sure to subscribe. Among the sleek, tailored suits and polished shoes, a man moved quietly and unnoticed. Charles George, a black man in his early 40s, pushed his cleaning cart through the corridors of Lionel's executive floor. His uniform was faded, his shoes worn, and a quiet calm surrounded him. To the high-flying executives and assistants that filled the building, Charles was invisible. He had been working there for months, but no one seemed to know his name or even acknowledge his presence. That was exactly how he wanted it. As Charles wiped down the conference room tables, he overheard snippets of conversation from the adjoining office. The CEO, a sharp-tongued white woman named Vivien Albright, was holding court with her team, her voice carrying over the low hum of chatter. "Get me those numbers by tomorrow," Vivien snapped. "I don't care how late you have to stay. If we're not ahead by the next quarter, heads will roll." Charles couldn't help but glance through the glass walls of the office, watching as Vivien paced with the air of someone who controlled not just a company, but an empire. Vivien Albright was notorious in the industry, a woman who had clawed her way to the top of one of the world's largest corporations with sheer ruthlessness. She was known for her unyielding demeanor and her intolerance for what she considered mediocrity. Under her leadership, Lionel Enterprises had seen record profits, but at a heavy cost. Firings, layoffs, and a culture of fear that permeated every level of the company. Charles continued his cleaning, moving like a ghost through the building, his thoughts far deeper than anyone might guess. He knew everything there was to know about Vivien Albright. More, in fact, than she could ever imagine. A few hours later, after most of the staff had left, Charles found himself alone on the executive floor. Vivien's office lights were still on, as they always were, and she was hunched over her desk, working late as usual. He could see her frustration as she combed through financial reports, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently on the sleek black desk. Charles glanced at his watch. It was time. With a quiet confidence, he pushed his cleaning cart into Vivien's office, his presence barely registering with her at first. She didn't even look up as he approached, still focused on the spreadsheets in front of her. "Excuse me, Miss Albright," he said, his voice calm but firm. Vivien finally looked up, her eyes narrowing at the sight of the janitor standing in her office. "What do you want?" she asked, annoyance dripping from her voice. Charles didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. He placed it gently on her desk, the sound of the paper barely a whisper. "What's this?" Vivien snapped, her irritation growing. "Your termination papers," Charles replied, his voice steady. "Effective immediately, you are no longer the CEO of Lionel Enterprises." For a moment, the room was filled with a stunned silence. Vivien stared at the envelope as if it were some kind of joke. Then she laughed, a cold, incredulous sound. "You must be out of your mind," she sneered. "You're just a janitor. Who do you think you are, walking into my office and—" "I'm Charles George," he interrupted, his voice cutting through her disbelief. "And I'm not just a janitor. I'm the majority shareholder of Lionel Enterprises, and I've just decided that your services are no longer required." Vivien's laughter died in her throat. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, real fear flickered across her face. She grabbed the envelope, tearing it open with shaking hands. As she read the letter inside, her skin turned pale. Charles George wasn't just a cleaning man. He was the true owner of Lionel Enterprises, a fact that had been meticulously hidden for months. While Vivien had been running the day-to-day operations of the company, Charles had been quietly observing, biding his time. He had spent years building his fortune, using a network of proxies and shell companies to acquire controlling interest in the very corporation that Vivien thought she ruled. I don't understand, Vivien stammered, her voice shaking as she looked up at Charles. This can't be real. How is this possible? Charles smiled, a quiet, composed smile that reflected none of the malice she had shown him over the months. You never asked who I was, he said simply. You never cared. To you, I was just the man who cleaned your floors, invisible and insignificant. But you never looked deeper, and now, your time is up. Vivien tried to compose herself, grasping for some way to salvage her authority. You can't do this, she said, her voice rising in desperation. I've built this company. You need me. Charles shook his head. You built it on fear, on treating people as if they were beneath you. I don't need you. The company doesn't need you. And as of tonight, you're finished. Vivien stood up, her pride crumbling before her very eyes. You'll regret this, she hissed. You'll see. Lionel Enterprises will fall apart without me. Charles's gaze remained steady. Lionel Enterprises will thrive without you. It's time for real leadership. Leadership that values people, not just profits. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving Vivien standing alone, her once unshakable confidence shattered. As Charles made his way out of the building, the same cleaning cart rolling quietly beside him, he reflected on the irony of it all. For months, he had moved silently through the halls of the corporation he owned, ignored and underestimated by everyone, especially Vivien Albright. But now, the invisible man had revealed himself, and nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, the headlines were ablaze with the news. CEO ousted by secret shareholder in shocking power play. As the story spread, people across Monaco and the world began to ask the same question. Who is Charles George? But by the time they found their answers, Charles was already 2 steps ahead, planning the next move in his quiet but unstoppable rise. The next morning, Monaco was buzzing with the story of Vivien Albright's sudden ousting. It was the kind of scandal that electrified the city. A fall from grace so abrupt and unexpected that even the most connected insiders were left scrambling for answers. But the one question on everyone's lips was the same. Who was Charles George? Inside the sleek office towers of Lionel Enterprises, the mood was tense. Executives whispered in hushed tones, analysts pored over stock prices, and rumors about Charles George, the mysterious figure who had quietly seized control, spread like wildfire. Some claimed he was a shadowy billionaire from Africa. Others speculated he was a corporate raider out to dismantle the company piece by piece. But no one knew for sure. All anyone could agree on was that everything had changed overnight. Meanwhile, Charles sat in his new corner office, the one that had once belonged to Vivien. The view of the shimmering Mediterranean stretched out before him, the yachts gliding through the water like toys from this height. His posture was relaxed, but his mind was sharp, already planning the next phase of Lionel's future. He'd come a long way from where he'd started, the son of a working-class family in the outskirts of New York, who had been underestimated his entire life. His rise had been strategic, calculated. From the shadows, he had built an empire. But unlike Vivien, he hadn't relied on cutthroat tactics or cruelty to get ahead. He believed in watching, waiting, and understanding every piece of the puzzle before making his move. There was a knock at his door. It was Marie, one of the senior executives who had survived Vivien's ruthless tenure. She stepped in cautiously, still unsure how to approach the man who had, until yesterday, been mopping the floors of the building. "Mr. George," she said, her voice measured, "the board is ready for you. They have a lot of questions." Charles nodded, standing up with a quiet confidence that belied the months he had spent moving through the company unnoticed. "I'm sure they do," he said, offering her a calm smile. "Let's go answer them." As Charles walked into the boardroom, the atmosphere shifted. The board members, powerful men and women who had once answered only to Vivien, sat stiffly in their chairs, their eyes darting between one another. Charles could feel their unease. They had been blindsided, and it was obvious they didn't know what to expect. "Mr. George," the chairman of the board, an older man named Leonard Bradford, began, "we've all been surprised by recent events. I think I speak for everyone when I say we need to understand what's happening. Who exactly are you? Charles smiled slightly, taking a seat at the head of the table. I understand your concerns, Mr. Bradford, he said, his tone even and composed, and I'm here to give you the clarity you need. He leaned forward, locking eyes with each board member. For months I've been observing this company from within, learning its strengths, its weaknesses, and most importantly, its people. Lionel Enterprises is indeed a global leader, but it's been running on fear. Fear of failure, fear of not meeting profit targets, fear of leadership that sees people as expendable. That's not how I lead. The room was still. Charles could sense the gears turning in their minds. He wasn't what they had anticipated, not a hostile outsider, not a corporate invader. He was something far more complex. I grew up where opportunities were few and hard work was the only currency that mattered, Charles continued. I learned patience and strategy. When I started acquiring shares in Lionel, my goal wasn't to dismantle it. I saw potential to lead differently, to create something stronger, more meaningful. Marie, who had been silently observing from the corner, finally broke her silence. But how did you stay hidden? No one knew who you were. Why the secrecy? Charles turned toward her, his expression softening. It wasn't secrecy, Marie. It was necessary. I needed to see how people behaved when they believed no one was watching. That's when you discover the truth about a company. Vivien thought she was untouchable, that her power came from instilling fear. But real power comes from understanding an organization from its core, from the ground up. Leonard, frowning in concentration, leaned forward. And now? What's your plan for Lionel? Charles grinned. Growth, innovation, fairness. We're going to build on the strengths of this company and fix what's broken. I'll be restructuring leadership. Those who've been ignored will get a chance to rise, and those who thrived on fear and intimidation, like Vivien, will find they no longer belong here. The board exchanged uncertain glances. They hadn't foreseen this. They had prepared for upheaval, for a hostile coup. But instead, Charles offered them stability, a fresh approach rooted in values long forgotten at Lionel. After the meeting, standing by his office window, Charles received a call from his brother Nathan, who had been his silent partner throughout the whole process. You did it, Nathan said, pride evident in his voice. You actually pulled it off. Charles smiled, eyes fixed on the sunset. This is only the beginning, Nathan. There's a lot of work ahead. Nathan chuckled. So what's next, now that everyone knows who you are? Charles paused, considering. Now, he replied. Now we build something unforgettable, something better, for everyone. In the days that followed, news of Lionel Enterprises' transformation spread. Charles George, the man no one saw coming, had fired the CEO and taken control. But instead of the dramatic takeover people expected, it became a story of quiet strength, integrity, and vision. And in Monaco, a city of wealth and status, Charles had delivered a powerful lesson. True power doesn't come from titles or appearances. It comes from understanding and recognizing the invisible. Charles George had once been invisible, but now the world couldn't ignore him. Leave a comment if this story resonated with you. Your engagement is deeply appreciated. Thank you, and I look forward to your likes.